When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our Vice Presidencies series, I am joined by my co-host, Alex. Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jerry, for having me, and hello, everybody.
We are recording this on Memorial Day 2024. We both have the day off and thought that we would take a little time to talk about, well, not really vice presidents, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Before we do, Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a wonderful weekend. The weather's been warm, definitely a intro to summer, but it's been a good weekend, and I'm just happy to be here. Hope everybody's having a great weekend, and yeah.
All right. So with our last episode, George Clinton, the fourth person to serve as vice president, passed away while still serving as the sitting vice president. So there was still time left in his term. What happened? So Alex, do you know what would happen? And this is the first instance, and as we talked about in our intro episode, there are going to be quite a few more of these to come. But do you know what happens when the sitting vice president passes away?
I have no idea.
So nowadays, we do have provisions in place for a new vice president to be named and confirmed, but then they really didn't. There was nothing in the Constitution which talked about what to do if a vice president died or couldn't serve anymore. But the business of the Senate had to keep going. But the business of the Senate couldn't keep going unless somebody was presiding over the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, I thought that today we would talk about the office of President pro tempore of the Senate.
Okay.
So, Alex, I imagine, like our listeners, you're probably wondering, what the heck is a president pro tempore?
Well, it's not a tempura, that's for sure. Sorry, couldn't resist.
It's not battered and fried, that's for sure.
Yeah, although I'm sure they probably felt that way in this particular instance. So, yeah, kind of curious to hear how this came about.
So this office is actually a constitutional office. It was created in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 5. And I quote from the Constitution, "The Senate shall choose their other officers and also a president pro tempore in the absence of the vice president or when he shall exercise the office of president of the United States." So basically, just as, and you remember in our intro episode, we talked about how the powers of the president, quote unquote, devolve upon the vice president during a vacancy in that office. Likewise, the role of president of the Senate, which is held by the vice president, devolves upon the chosen president pro tempore in the absence of the vice president. Now, as initially conceived, there wasn't a need for a president pro tempore at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Just when the vice president was absent in order to ensure that Senate business was able to continue. And we talked about in our first few episodes, this idea that the sitting vice president may come late, as the session's already started, or may leave before the session's over. At that time, they would name a president pro tempore so that the Senate business could actually continue through the rest of the term.
Okay.
So from the time of the first session of the first Congress to the point where William H. Crawford was elected President pro tempore on March 24th, 1812, which was a 23-year time frame.
Wow.
24 individuals had been chosen as President pro tempore.
24.
24.
Good grief.
Now, most of these were just for very short terms, starting with, the first one was John Langdon of New Hampshire. He was chosen on April 6, 1789. He would serve during Vice President Adams's 15-day absence, then for another 2 days in early August during another absence. So not long periods of time, but just somebody needed to preside over the Senate. Now, that seems like a lot of folks, but like I said, most would only serve for a short term.
What's new from Apple? There's the new iPhone 16 Pro, built for Apple Intelligence. And it comes with the all-new camera control, giving you an easier way to quickly access your camera tools. The new Apple Watch Series 10 has our biggest display and our thinnest design ever. And this? It's the sound of active noise cancellation, now available on one of 2 new AirPods 4 models. So quiet. Check out all of the new products and new features at apple.com. You can even buy yourself something new. See apple.com for product availability updates. Apple Intelligence coming this fall.
The original list I was working from as I started thinking about this, and I'll talk a little bit about why, what my thought pattern is with this and why we're going to talk about presidents pro tempore. But unlike the vice presidency, their service came to an end when the session ended. And so the original list, it just kept on even when the Senate was out of session, but technically they weren't president pro tempore at that point. So in true presidency's fashion, I recalculated.
Okay.
So
there you go. I knew you would do your due diligence.
Yes. So of the 24 folks to serve prior to Crawford, and we'll talk about why Crawford is important in a minute, the average term of service for a president pro tempore was 27.27 days.
Good grief.
As a whole, the 24 served 634 days, or around 1.7 years out of the 23-year time frame. 3 served 2 non-consecutive tenures as president pro tempore, the aforementioned John Langdon, along with Samuel Livermore, also of New Hampshire, and Stephen R. Bradley of Vermont. So, for some reason, they kept on re-electing New Englanders. Who knew?
Go figure.
But prior to Crawford, the president pro tempore who served the longest was John Brown of Kentucky, who served for 50 days at the beginning of the first session of the 8th Congress, then for 34 more days at the end of the term. This was the term prior to the Burr-Hamilton duel, just to put it into context.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So, why are we skipping ahead if I mention that there are already these 24 people who have served as president pro tempore? Why are we skipping ahead to Crawford?
Because this is the longest gap, I would imagine.
Exactly. There was no sitting vice president at that point. He had passed away. And so my thought pattern with this, it's going to give us a chance to explore some individuals who are really not that well known, well understood. It also helps to fill in that gap of time that there was no vice president. And, I just thought we'd see what comes out of this.
Well, just a quick question before we start looking into these individuals.
Yeah.
So how much time was there left in P. Funk's term as vice president?
So, good question. Once William H. Crawford was elected, he served for 344 days.
So almost a year.
Almost a year. Yeah.
Okay.
Because basically what happened, so, he died in April 1812. And so that was a presidential election year, 1812. Elbridge Gerry was chosen to join Madison on the re-election ticket. He ultimately would win and become vice president on March 4th, 1813. But in that gap period, they needed somebody to actually preside over the Senate because the Senate business couldn't stop. And especially considering this is the time, the build up to the War of 1812.
Yeah.
So by the Presidential Succession Act of 1792, the president pro tempore was the second in the line of presidential succession after the vice president. When VP Clinton died, if something had happened to Madison, Crawford would have succeeded to the presidency. So he was next in line.
Wow.
And this was a time that James Madison was not somebody known for his good constitution. He was always a little bit sickly. He had bouts of ill health during his presidency. So this wasn't completely, it wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for something to happen to James Madison.
Yeah.
Now we know it didn't. James Madison would go on to win re-election, serve out his second term, but just know that once William Crawford's chosen, he is the next in line for the presidency.
So they had to make that decision very carefully and with a lot of gravity, I guess, because this guy, Madison is like, whoa, he might not be around.
Well, and Madison didn't get to choose.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The Senate chooses their own officers, including President pro tempore. So that reflects that Crawford was at least seen as being something of a key leader in the Senate. And we'll get some of that in a minute. But basically, he was second in line, but then also by the nature of the office of President pro tempore of the Senate, he became the chief presiding officer of the Senate. Now, he didn't really take all of the vice presidential roles, so he couldn't exercise the vice president's tie-breaking vote authority because the president pro tempore was already a sitting senator and he couldn't vote twice. But still, presiding over the Senate, being able to have some say-so about Senate proceedings, that still does give him a little bit of wiggle room and gravitas and authority. The president pro tempore would remain second in the line of succession until the Presidential Succession Act of 1886, which removed both the president pro tem and the Speaker of the House from the line of succession. They were returned under the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, but their place was switched. So now the Speaker of the House is next in line behind the Vice President. The President pro tem is after the Speaker.
Yeah.
And this is the law as it stands today.
Yeah.
But my thoughts with this, and especially where we're going to have so many gaps, is let's talk about the President pro tems that served during those gap periods. Let's get a sense of what might have been going on in the Senate in those times. What, if any, role these President pro tems played. But because they're not vice presidents, we're not going to rank them.
Okay.
We're just going to explore a little bit of their lives. So we will actually have, and there are technically 36 tenures of president pro tems to talk about. Now, some of these will serve multiple tenures, so we'll just talk about them probably once and leave it there. I'm still trying to work out exactly how this will work because, of course, there are some president pro tems, Crawford only served for less than a year, but like the case of John Tyler, who succeeded to the presidency after Harrison died 1 month in office, that leaves a gap of 3 years and 11 months that president pro tems served under. So some are going to serve for longer. We've also got some interesting characters here and some folks who really do serve as leaders in the Senate. Now, little trivia here, Alex. Do you know who is the last president pro tem to actually serve during a gap in the vice presidency?
I don't know the person's name, but would it be the president pro tem that served during LBJ's time?
So you're almost there. Have to go a little further because if you'll recall, not only did Richard Nixon's first vice president resign,
right,
but then Gerald Ford became vice president through this process, that came about to actually be able to fill a vacancy in the vice presidency. But then Gerald Ford succeeded to the presidency, and so there was yet another gap until Nelson Rockefeller was in place as VP.
Yeah.
And the person who served in both of those instances was from your home state of Mississippi, James Eastland.
James Eastland. Okay. I know that name. I know that name.
Yeah. So we'll get to talk about him. And like I said, there are so many figures in here. There are a couple such as with William Crawford that we're going to be covering in a Seat at the Table episode, which, again, I'll talk about that in just a minute. We also have one who becomes vice president who we'll be talking about. So, again, still trying to figure out exactly what this is going to look like. But in the case of William Crawford, because we are covering him fully in a Seat at the Table episode, which is coming out not too long around the release of this episode, so not going to be too long for you to learn fully about William Crawford. I thought in this case we would just talk about his time as President Pro Tem.
Sounds good.
And then listen to the full episode of the Seat at the Table to learn all about Crawford. But just for our purposes here, Alex, just to kind of give you a brief summary of Crawford to this point that he becomes President Pro Tem. So William Crawford is from Georgia. He would do kind of a rise through the ranks and ultimately come to the Senate. At this point, he's still relatively new to the Senate, but he's making a pretty large impact early on, and obviously enough that folks decide he should be President Pro Tem when George Clinton passes away.
Okay.
So, as a reflection of his growing prominence, when the Senate had to adjourn on March 23rd due to the illness of Vice President Clinton, the following day, Crawford was elected as President Pro Tempore of the Senate to preside over the body in Clinton's absence to allow them to continue their business. But with Clinton's death on April 20th, it was decided, a President Pro Tempore was needed until the next vice president could be inaugurated in 1813. So Crawford was reelected to the post in the next session, and he would preside over the body through the special session of the 13th Congress. So Crawford's biographer, Chase Mooney, says, quote, he, i.e. Crawford, seems not to have used his position to make partisan appointments or confer personal favors, but the use of his influence as presiding officer, and perhaps now as leader of the administration forces, can be inferred from the voting on a few occasions.
Okay.
And so that's one thing that we've talked about in the Madison series. Even though Madison supporters technically had the majority of seats in the Senate, there was a sizable minority who, though they were Democratic Republicans, were opposed to Madison and his administration. So the fact that they've got a pro-administration person as President Pro Tempore really helps to push the administration's agenda along. Also, as noted by Mooney, quote, Crawford, removed from active participation by virtue of his position as presiding officer, voted consistently with the war party. And yes, by this point, war had been declared against Great Britain, and the War of 1812 was on. So this was an important place to have somebody who could help with the administration's efforts at this key time in the nation's history.
Okay.
But also, you really have to imagine, trying to figure out what the office of President Pro Tempore looks like in the complete absence of the vice president. The vice president is not coming back.
No, he's not.
No.
Not in this case.
P-Funk, the party has passed.
The P-Funk party has definitely stopped.
And indeed, Crawford had been in the 1913 majority in the Senate who voted for the declaration of war in June 1812. Now, Crawford had had his eyes on the Spanish-held territory in Florida for some time, and with the coming of war and the fact that the independent portion of Spain was an ally of Great Britain, he advocated for American forces seizing the remainder of Florida as part of the concurrent Creek War happening in the southwestern portion of the U.S. So he's like, well, we've declared war on Britain, but let's go ahead and take Florida as well. Now, unfortunately, Crawford could not secure congressional approval for the taking of East Florida, only West Florida, which was the portion of the Gulf Coast to modern-day southern Alabama. So getting part of Florida, not all of Florida. Now, I mentioned that Crawford was a supporter of the administration, but this didn't mean that he didn't criticize the administration's prosecution of the war. And in particular, he criticized the lack of vigorous and knowledgeable leadership provided by Secretary of War William Eustis and Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton, both whom have been covered in the Seat at the Table series. You and I actually talked about Hamilton.
Yes.
So when Secretary of State Monroe reached out to Crawford in early December 1812 for a meeting, and shared with him his desire of replacing the outgoing Eustis at the War Department, Crawford shared with him his concern that Monroe's confirmation would not be guaranteed. So this is, and again, we kind of see this, the administration and an administration official coming to Crawford as president pro tempore and saying, hey, we want to make a change. We're going to have to get this nomination through the Senate. What do you think? And Crawford's like, I don't think you're going to get through the Senate, even with his support.
Wow.
And indeed, Crawford, whether asked by President Madison or not, offered up his opinion about the top contenders for the War Department. So I didn't find where Madison actually asked him to give him some ideas, but Crawford was like, you're going to hear what I have to say.
He had a little bit of attitude, huh?
Just a little bit. This
Okay.
office is kind of going to his head.
Call him Krabby Crawford.
There we go.
We
We got
have
the
a nickname, folks. You know me.
We got the nickname.
All right.
So he went through kind of the top contenders for the War Department. So, of course, Monroe's on there, even though he doesn't think that he's going to get confirmed by the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Also, General John Armstrong, General Henry Dearborn, New York Governor Daniel Tompkins, and General William Henry Harrison. So Crawford, even though he knew of them, he couldn't really speak much to the latter three, but he asserted that he felt Armstrong, quote, did not possess the confidence of the nation, and had already given his thoughts on Monroe, as we discussed. Crawford would find himself approached about taking up the position, but he declined in early January 1813. So Madison was like, hey, it's great that you're talking about these other candidates. How about you? And he was like, no, I think I'm good. So there's apparently a theory that the administration insiders wanted Monroe to move to the War Department, Gallatin to take up the State Department, and Crawford to take up the role of Secretary of the Treasury. So that would have been a really big reshuffle, but I really wasn't able to find much evidence in terms of primary resources to validate this theory. Ultimately, Monroe would remain at State. Gallatin would stay at Treasury for the time being. And then John Armstrong would be brought in as head of the War Department. Again, you can find out more about Armstrong as well as the others in their episodes. Rather than putting Crawford at odds with the administration, his criticism would result in him being brought more into the fold, and as noted by Mooney, quote, a closer personal relationship was developing between Crawford and Madison. And so I say this in the context of this is the person who's next in line for the presidency. And we've already seen in the series that vice presidents typically aren't consulted that much by the sitting president.
Right.
But in this case, you have somebody who's next in line who is actually being consulted a bit more by the administration.
Maybe he won't be quite as crabby now.
Maybe he won't. So Crawford advised Madison in early March 1813 that our old friend, General James Wilkinson, was detested by the people of New Orleans, which was where he was posted at the time. And soon enough, Wilkinson was transferred to the northern front of the war. Crawford was also in the minority, voting against Wilkinson's promotion to the rank of Major General. So, again, he has some influence here. But with Elbridge Gerry becoming the fifth vice president on March 4th, 1813, and as there was no special session after the inauguration, Crawford's tenure as president pro tem came to an end with the end of the 12th U.S. Congress. Now, Crawford actually resigned his Senate seat in late March 1813 to assume a new role as U.S. Minister to France, which we'll talk more about on his Seat at the Table episode. So be sure to check that out. But to wrap up his tenure as president pro tem, he served for 344 days from March 24th, 1812 to March 3rd, 1813. He would be the first, but as we'll see, not the last president pro tem moved up in the line of succession due to the death of a VP. And spoiler alert, we won't have long to wait for the next one.
Yes.
Yes.
Unfortunately.
But with that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope that gave everybody some insight about the role of President Pro Tem, what's going on during these interregnums where there is no sitting vice president. And like I said, I'm looking forward to being able to explore some of these individuals who are not that well known. Some are even more obscure than the vice presidents that we're going to discuss. And I think that'll give us a clearer picture of what happens with this role of president of the Senate when there's no vice president. So, Alex, what are your thoughts?
It's very cool. Again, I was familiar with the role of President Pro Temp, but now having it explained a bit more and kind of really understanding how it falls in line with the state administration as a whole, it's very interesting. So I'm very curious to see how this plays out in future episodes.
Yeah, and the role does change over time. Mm-hmm. Now it's really seen as being, the person who is the most senior in the Senate, mm-hmm. and it's a role that's, largely more ceremonial, but it's also a role that is constantly filled. There's none of this having to choose somebody because, the vice president's not here.
Right.
They already know who the president pro tem is. So it'll be interesting to see how this shifts, as well as the role of the vice president as we go along.
Very cool.
So with that, thank you so much for listening. And we hope that you will join us for the next Vice Presidency's episode, which will be on Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. And yes, he is that Gary whose name was adopted for that term that often comes up in politics then and now, gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering. I thought it was named after you. Come on now.
I am not the gerrymander, I promise.
Jerry with a G and not a J.
Not a J.
All right.
But thank you so much for listening. If you want to see what sources were used for this episode and listen to past episodes of the podcast, if this is somehow your first Vice Presidency's episode and you want to go back and listen to the others, you can find those on the website at presidenciespodcast.com. You can connect on social media with us. We are on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. You can send us an email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. And with that, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.